What started as a routine late-night interview turned into television chaos when Samuel L. Jackson walked off Jimmy Kimmel Live after a heated confrontation about Hollywood's treatment of veteran black actors erupted into an ugly public dispute. The tension was palpable from the moment Samuel L. Jackson stepped onto the Jimmy Kimmel Live stage. What should have been a standard promotional interview for his latest film quickly devolved into one of the most uncomfortable moments in late-night television history. The veteran actor, known for his commanding presence and no-nonsense attitude, seemed unusually reserved as he took his seat across from Kimmel. Kimmel opened with his typical brand of humor, but there was something different in his demeanor tonight. Perhaps it was the recent criticism he'd been facing about his interviewing style, or maybe the pressure from declining ratings, but the host appeared more aggressive than usual. His first question came loaded with an undertone that immediately put Jackson on edge. "So, Sam, you've been in Hollywood for decades now. Some people are saying that maybe it's time for the older generation to step aside and make room for fresh faces. What's your take on that?" Kimmel asked with what appeared to be a smirk. Jackson's expression shifted noticeably. The question wasn't just inappropriate, it was insulting. Here was a man who had built a legendary career spanning over 40 years, being asked essentially if he should retire on national television. The audience sensed the immediate tension, their laughter from Kimmel's opening monologue quickly fading into an uncomfortable silence. "Excuse me?" Jackson replied, his voice carrying that familiar edge that moviegoers knew meant trouble was brewing. "Are you seriously asking me if I should retire because of my age?" Kimmel, perhaps realizing he'd struck a nerve but doubling down instead of backing off, leaned forward with false bravado. "Well, I mean, there's a lot of discussion in Hollywood about making space for younger talent. Some critics have said that certain actors are just recycling the same performances over and over again." The camera captured Jackson's jaw tightening. This wasn't just a poorly thought-out question anymore. This was a direct attack on his craft and legacy. The audience began to murmur, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented. "Let me get this straight," Jackson said, his voice dangerously calm. "You brought me on your show to tell me I'm washed up and that I should make room for younger actors? Is that what this is about?" Kimmel's nervous laughter filled the awkward silence. No, I'm just asking what you think about the changing landscape of Hollywood. It's a legitimate question." "Legitimate?" Jackson's voice rose slightly, and anyone familiar with his work knew this was a warning sign. What's legitimate about suggesting that experience and skill should be discarded for youth? What's legitimate about implying that my 4 decades in this business mean nothing? The host seemed to realize he was in dangerous territory but made the fatal mistake of trying to deflect with humor instead of apologizing. "Hey, I'm just the messenger here. Don't shoot the messenger, right?" He chuckled at his own reference to Jackson's famous films, but the joke fell completely flat. Jackson stared at Kimmel for a long moment, the silence stretching uncomfortably. When he finally spoke, his words were measured and deliberate. "You think this is funny? You think disrespecting someone who's been working in this industry since before you knew what a camera was is comedy?" The audience was completely silent now. Even the band members seemed frozen in place. This wasn't the playful banter of typical late-night television. This was a real confrontation brewing between two men with very different ideas about respect and professionalism. Kimmel, seemingly oblivious to how badly he was handling the situation, pressed on. "Look, I respect what you've done, but you have to admit that some of your recent choices haven't been, well, let's just say they haven't been Oscar-worthy." The moment those words left Kimmel's mouth, the atmosphere in the studio became electric with tension. Jackson's eyes narrowed and his entire posture changed. This wasn't just about age or career longevity anymore. Kimmel had just questioned his artistic integrity on live television. "Oscar-worthy?" Jackson repeated slowly, his voice now carrying the full weight of his decades of experience and the countless barriers he'd broken down in Hollywood. You want to talk about Oscar-worthy? Let's talk about how many black actors have been overlooked by the Academy. Let's talk about how the industry has systematically undervalued performers who look like me for generations. Kimmel shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly realizing that what he'd intended as light interview banter had evolved into something much more serious. But instead of acknowledging his mistake, he made another crucial error in judgment. Come on, Sam. You can't play the race card every time someone criticizes your work, Kimmel said with a dismissive wave of his hand. The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. The audience gasped audibly. Even the cameramen seemed to recoil at what they'd just heard. Jackson sat perfectly still for a moment, processing what had just been said to him on national television. When he finally responded, his voice carried the controlled fury of a man who had faced decades of exactly this kind of dismissive attitude. "The race card?" he said, each word deliberate and sharp. "Did you just tell me that pointing out systemic racism in Hollywood is playing a card?" The interview had officially crossed a line from which there would be no return. Jackson leaned forward, in his chair, his legendary composure finally beginning to crack. "You know what, Jimmy? I've been in this business long enough to recognize when someone is trying to bait me, and I've been patient enough to give you the benefit of the doubt. But what you just said crossed every line of professional decency." Kimmel, perhaps sensing he'd gone too far but unwilling to back down in front of his live audience, made another catastrophic decision. "Look, I'm just trying to have an honest conversation here. Maybe you're being a little too sensitive about this whole thing." The word sensitive seemed to detonate something inside Jackson. His hands gripped the arms of his chair, and his voice dropped to that menacing whisper that had made him famous in dozens of films. "Sensitive? You think calling out your unprofessional behavior makes me sensitive?" The studio audience was completely frozen now, watching what felt like a car crash, in slow motion. Even Kimmel's usually supportive crowd seemed uncomfortable with their host's approach. The camera operators were getting shots they never expected, capturing every micro-expression of what was becoming television history. "I think maybe we should take a commercial break," one of the producers could be heard whispering urgently off-camera, but both men were too locked in their confrontation to pay attention. Kimmel, sweating now under the studio lights and the pressure of the moment, doubled down once again. "Sam, you're overreacting to some simple questions. This is exactly the kind of attitude that makes people think Hollywood actors are out of touch with reality." Jackson stood up slowly from his chair, his full height and presence commanding the entire studio. The audience collectively held its breath. "Out of touch with reality? Let me tell you about reality, Jimmy. Reality is being one of the highest-grossing actors in film history and still having to justify my place in this industry to someone like you." "Someone like me?" Kimmel shot back, his own temper finally flaring. "I'm just asking the questions that everyone else is thinking. Maybe the problem isn't with the questions, maybe it's with your ability to handle criticism." The confrontation had reached a fever pitch. Jackson's voice rose to fill the entire studio, carrying decades of frustration and the weight of every slight he'd endured throughout his career. "Criticism? You call disrespect and racial dismissiveness criticism? You've shown more respect to comedians promoting their Netflix specials than you've shown to me tonight." Kimmel made one final devastating mistake. Standing up to match Jackson's energy, he pointed his finger directly at the actor. "Don't lecture me about respect when you can't even handle a simple interview without losing your cool. Maybe this is exactly why some people think it's time for you to step back." The studio fell into absolute silence. Jackson stared at Kimmel for what felt like an eternity, processing the full scope of what had just happened. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but carried the weight of finality. "You know what, Jimmy? You're right about one thing. It is time for me to step back. I'm stepping back from this interview, from this show, and from giving people like you any more of my time or energy." Jackson began removing his microphone, his movements deliberate and controlled, despite the obvious anger coursing through him. The audience watched in stunned silence as one of Hollywood's most respected actors prepared to walk away from what had become a complete disaster. Kimmel, finally realizing the magnitude of what was happening, made a desperate attempt at damage control. "Sam, come on, let's just calm down and finish the interview like professionals." Jackson paused in his mic removal and looked directly at Kimmel with an expression that could have melted steel. "Professionals? You want to talk about being professional now? After spending the last 10 minutes questioning my relevance, my talent, and dismissing my concerns about racism as playing cards?" The tension in the studio was now so thick it was almost visible. Camera operators zoomed in on both men, capturing every detail of what had become the most explosive late-night television moment in years. Social media was already beginning to buzz as clips started circulating online. "This conversation is over," Jackson declared, dropping his microphone onto his chair with a finality that echoed through the silent studio. But Kimmel, in a moment of stunning poor judgment, wasn't ready to let it end. As Jackson turned to leave, the host called out loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Running away isn't going to change the fact that your best days are behind you, Sam." Jackson stopped dead in his tracks. The entire studio seemed to collectively gasp. Even the band members looked shocked at their host's audacity. Slowly, deliberately, Jackson turned back around, his face a mask of controlled fury that had intimidated audiences in countless films. "What did you just say to me?" Jackson's voice was deadly quiet, but it carried to every corner of the studio. Kimmel, perhaps drunk on adrenaline or simply incapable of reading the room, pressed forward with his attack. "You heard me. You're walking away because you can't handle the truth. Your career peaked 20 years ago, and everyone knows it except you." The silence that followed was deafening. Jackson walked back toward the interview area but not to his chair. Instead, he positioned himself directly in front of Kimmel's desk, towering over the host who suddenly seemed to realize he might have pushed too far. "Let me tell you something, Jimmy," Jackson began, his voice rising with each word. "I've been in this industry for over 4 decades. I've worked with directors you couldn't even get a meeting with. I've broken barriers that you've never even had to face. And I've done it all while maintaining my dignity and professionalism. Something you clearly know nothing about." The audience began to murmur their agreement, the tide clearly turning against their usual host. Camera phones were now visible throughout the audience as people began recording what they knew was television history. "You want to talk about truth?" Jackson continued, his voice now filling every inch of the studio. "Here's the truth. You brought me on this show tonight not to promote my work, but to try to tear me down for your own entertainment. You've shown me less respect than you'd show a reality TV contestant, and you've done it all while hiding behind the guise of just asking questions." Kimmel tried to interject. "Sam, I think you're—" "I'm not finished!" Jackson's voice boomed, with the authority of someone who had commanded respect on movie sets around the world. "You've questioned my relevance, attacked my artistic choices, dismissed my concerns about racism, and then had the unmitigated gall to tell me I'm being too sensitive. And now, when I decide I've had enough of your disrespect, you insult me as I'm leaving." The studio audience began to applaud, slowly at first, then building to thunderous approval. Jackson raised his hand to quiet them, not finished with what he had to say. "But here's what really bothers me, Jimmy. It's not just about me. It's about every veteran actor, every person of color, everyone who's ever been told they should step aside to make room for someone younger or more marketable. Your attitude tonight represents everything that's wrong with this industry's treatment of experienced professionals." Kimmel sat frozen in his chair, finally understanding the magnitude of his mistakes, but seemingly paralyzed to respond appropriately. Jackson's voice took on a tone of finality. "I came here tonight to talk about my craft, my new project, and maybe share some stories that your audience would enjoy. Instead, I've been subjected to what can only be described as a public ambush designed to humiliate me." "Well, congratulations, Jimmy. You've succeeded in showing everyone exactly who you are." The actor turned toward the audience, his demeanor shifting to acknowledge the people who had been witnessing this debacle. "To the audience here tonight, and watching at home, I apologize that you had to witness this unprofessional display. You deserve better entertainment than watching someone try to tear down a guest for cheap laughs." As Jackson began walking toward the exit, the audience erupted in sustained applause and a standing ovation. The cameras followed him as he moved, with dignity toward the stage door, while Kimmel sat at his desk looking stunned and deflated. Just before reaching the exit, Jackson paused and turned back one final time. "Jimmy, you asked if it was time for me to step aside. I'll leave that decision to the people who actually matter, the audiences who support my work, and the colleagues who respect what I bring to this industry. As for you, maybe it's time you took a long look in the mirror and asked yourself if this is really the kind of host you want to be." With that, Samuel L. Jackson walked off the Jimmy Kimmel Live stage with his head held high, leaving behind a stunned studio and a host who had clearly bitten off more than he could chew. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Within hours, clips of the confrontation were trending across all social media platforms. "Respect Samuel Jackson" and "Kimmel crossed the line" became the top trending topics worldwide. Entertainment industry veterans and newcomers alike rallied to Jackson's defense, praising his grace under pressure and condemning Kimmel's behavior. The show's ratings plummeted in the following weeks as advertisers pulled their support and celebrity guests began declining appearances. Kimmel was forced to issue multiple public apologies, but the damage to his reputation was irreversible. Meanwhile, Jackson's standing in Hollywood was only elevated by his dignified handling of the situation, proving once again why he remained one of the industry's most respected figures. The confrontation served as a watershed moment, sparking important conversations about respect, professionalism, and the treatment of veteran performers in entertainment.